Trump booked in Georgia. We got that illustrious mugshot. What do you make of the news or like some of the reporting that he wanted this booking to happen in prime time, and then also paired with his strategic return to Twitter, which is essentially his attempt to fundraise off of this?
I mean, I think Trump, he is, if nothing else, an old-fashioned showman, and the way he sees it is there's no such thing as bad publicity, right? And so he
Yeah.
can he gets this booking, this mugshot, he poses for this mugshot very obviously. I wouldn't be shocked if he spent the day practicing that pose. And he can use it to fundraise, he can use it to rally his supporters, make him look persecuted. I mean, all sorts of things. I think he views it as unambiguously a good opportunity press wise for him. And I don't think he seriously thinks anything is going to really happen to him. I think that's the other piece of this. So I think from his perspective, it makes total sense to want to turn this into like an event of sorts. I happen to think that maybe he should take it a little more seriously, given the state of his legal team and the extent to which, for each of these indictments, whether the state one or the federal one, the prosecutors appear to be quite serious about this. But I think for Trump sees it as, this is another episode of the Trump show.
Do you really think that it hasn't sunk in for him that this is serious? Because it seems like at least his presidential campaign is somewhat frantic in it's existential for him, in that if he does not win the presidency, there's a very good chance he's going to prison/jail. And I don't know, it's hard to psychoanalyze him because he's so insane, but there has to be some understanding there, I would imagine.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? I think if you look at his decision to run for president in the first place, if you look at this campaign, it's clear that he understands on some level that the difference between winning and losing, as you suggested, will be the difference between being able to be free and maybe be in prison, or at least be under serious legal scrutiny for the rest of his life. At the same time, I don't think he can release himself from the compulsion to attract attention and get press. And so the booking yesterday, even if he recognizes that in some sense this is all very serious, I don't think he can actually help himself. I think there's no world in which Donald Trump did not try to turn his mugshot into a fundraising opportunity in an attempt to get more press. I just think that he is pathologically unable to resist that temptation and to really perform the seriousness of the charges against him.
Certainly. And I mean, just reflecting on the nature of these charges as well, it can get lost in the spectacle. But this was an attempt, a well thought out attempt to overturn the democratic results of an election involving a variety of, now what's it, 19 co-conspirators, including Donald Trump in this instance for Georgia. And in the federal indictment, there's 6 co-conspirators plus Trump. And so much of this is about really throwing out votes, specific votes, Democratic votes. And in the cases of what they tried to do in Georgia and some of their plots in places like Michigan, particularly urban centers, people that were more people of color, and also people that were tending to vote Democratic. And I think that context is really important to understanding the bile behind this, and that includes Giuliani saying that poll worker mother and daughter were passing around USB ports like vials of heroin and cocaine. If you could just put it in the larger context of voting rights and who gets to have voting rights and who doesn't have to get voting rights, or doesn't get to have voting rights in this country.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think you kind of set it up quite well, right? That the plot really centered on trying to invalidate, erase whatever verb you want to use, the votes of voters in the urban centers, Atlanta, Milwaukee, Philadelphia. These are all the places they targeted, and that's sort of just like a euphemism for saying they wanted to they wanted to invalidate the votes of black people. They didn't see them as not just that they were Democratic votes, but that in some sense they didn't really count. And that's like part of the language of Republican politics, that voters in these places don't really count. They're not really real Americans, right? We don't want a popular vote for president because we don't want our elections being determined by people in urban centers. And it's like, well, they're Americans too. They presumably their votes count the same as everyone else, but sort of on like this it's like ontological level for a lot of folks on that side, they don't. They are unequal votes and don't deserve to have the same say. And I think the plot to steal the election was like that idea taken to its logical conclusion, right? That if those votes are illegitimate, then we should be able to erase them from the ledger and then put in the rightful president. And the other thing I want to add here is that, 2 years, it's been 2 years, 3 years since the election, just about, and then 2 years since January 6th, a little more than 2 years. And it's tempting, I think, looking back, to treat this all as kind of a big kind of a little silly, like
circus.
Oh, well, this,
yeah,
circus. This really wasn't going to succeed. But you read that federal indictment, and Jeffrey Clark, I believe, suggests to the White House assistant counsel that, like, listen, if there are protests after we do this, we'll just bring in the army and shoot these people. And it's like, that's what was being considered in the White House. That if they were able to successfully invalidate these votes and there would be protests and civil unrest afterwards, they were going to use force against American citizens to sort of like solidify and cement their hold on power. So I think it's worth just saying, right, that like for as much as this seems like a big circus, these people were actually, no pun intended, deadly serious about what they were trying to do, and were deadly serious about what they intended to do to maintain that grip on power.
I mean, that's why you have to call it a coup attempt. I mean, and people, there were a lot of people who like to be contrarians in political discourse, saying, oh, look at these MSNBC liberals calling it a coup. How quaint, how silly, how hysterical. And then you see, oh no, there were attempts to also install Jeffrey Clark as the Attorney General. And only if it weren't for a Department of Justice internal revolt on that front, where they said hell no, that could have been possible, and he could have used the Insurrection Act to turn federal troops on anti-Trump protesters, just to like hammer that point home of what was being discussed at the highest levels of power in the Trump administration.
Right, and I think a lot of people have this temptation to kind of dismiss that as talk, but like at the level of presidential politics, at those levels of power, talk isn't simply talk. Talk represents an exercise of power. And so if people in the White House are discussing these sorts of tactics in furtherance of a plot to overturn the results of the election, that is the most serious thing one can imagine in a democracy, in an ostensibly democratic country. It is something that deserves, if not political scrutiny, then certainly some legal scrutiny, and that's what we're getting now. But I think I myself have even fallen into the habit of kind of talking about this as like, oh, this is a clown show. But it's worth reading that federal indictment. It's worth reading the state indictment and really reminding oneself that this was all very serious. This was all very, very serious. And the difference between a world, or the distance between a world in which it failed, the one we live in, and a world in which we succeeded, isn't that far, right? It amounts to sort of like a relative handful of people making the right choices and decisions at critical points. But those people didn't have to be there. Could have been other people, could have been less scrupulous people, could have been less honest people, and we would have had a very different outcome. And I think that's something to remember.
Certainly. And while in the public, they're, I think, using this free speech defense, which really doesn't hold any muster because it wasn't the speech. The federal indictment goes to great lengths to say that the speech is protected. It was the plots, the fraud attempts, the actions that followed. They can't use that in court, I think, to any real degree. What it seems like they're zeroing in on is, you can't get a fair trial in DC because,
Right.
you can't get a fair trial in Fulton County because, Fannie Willis. And it's kind of boiling underneath the surface. But in May, Brian Kemp signed a law that allows for the removal of prosecutors who aren't sufficiently tough on crime, was, I guess, the motivator that was stated on its face. But it's being fast-tracked to go into effect in October, which means that there's a possibility that the Republican legislature in Georgia could remove Fannie Willis from her position in the midst of this critical moment. And I mean, now that's really a terrifying prospect, at least in terms of the precedent that it sets. I'm not sure it would kill the investigation. I doubt it would, but still.
Right. I mean, I think,
or the trial, I should say. Yeah.
Right. It's very clear that this is dividing Republicans, and there are many Republicans who are so very loyal to Donald Trump. And so I would not be shocked to see the Georgia legislature attempt to do that. I want to quickly comment on this charge that Trump will never be able to get a fair trial. I mean, I think because he's Donald Trump, he's a former president, right? That does add the inherent difficulty that if people are polarized on anything, it's their views of Donald Trump, and everyone has one, and that's like a real consideration. But I've been on a jury. I was like on a week-long jury, and I will say people take that very seriously, and I think we have a habit of underestimating the degree to which Americans will take their civic duty seriously when they're presented to them seriously. When you say this is a thing to take seriously and this is a thing to the best of your abilities, you're going to need to be unbiased and non-partial. People will really try to do that, and so I think I have a total confidence that, in fact, Donald Trump will be able to get a fair trial, even from people who likely oppose him or voted against him. I think the idea that he can't, that it's impossible, is in fact kind of buying into one of the conceits of that a whole ideological movement, which is that the entire apparatus of the state, of the government, is biased against us, and so we have to dismantle it to get fairness. Like, no, people are capable of being fair. People are capable of being non-partial. And this process, I'd say, has been nothing but fair. If Donald Trump were any other person in America, the book would have been thrown at him years ago, right?
Yeah.
This has been beyond fair-minded and scrupulous.
Yeah, even the documents case. I mean, he had months and just ignored repeated requests and then sent back some of the documents, just not all of them, in an effort to conceal what he still wanted to hang on to. And other, low-level government officials who maybe have classified information and by accident or took it, they don't get that benefit of the doubt of returning it. There was a case, and I'm blanking on the name of the person, but someone who worked with the DOJ or the FBI who's just went to jail for like 10 months. Because
McGonigal,
might have been. Yeah, I can't remember.
Like
names.
the Russian the thing with the I'll double check.
Yeah,
just Charles McGonigal.
Yeah, and so he actually, in that case in particular, was given as much deference and leeway as humanly possible because of his position, which is the exact opposite of his claim, obviously.
Right.
Yeah. So, insane stuff.